When Paul Anderson appeared at the Holbrook police station one June morning, he barely looked human anymore. Skeletal, thin, hair long and matted solid, eyes completely vacant, like he'd just crawled out of the ground. The man had been missing 4 years earlier on Route 66, presumed dead somewhere in the Arizona desert. But the most terrifying thing wasn't his appearance. The most terrifying thing was the map covered in red marks that he carried with him, and what he said about the 4 years he spent locked in darkness with the person who made those marks. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the night of August 12, 2019, the stretch of Route 66 running from Williams to Seligman, an old highway cutting through the dry, barren plains of Arizona, was bathed in the thin yellow glow of scattered lonely signs, and the sound of wind sweeping across cracked asphalt, creating that signature empty feeling every long-haul driver remembers, so quiet that the sound of a car door closing echoed like something unnatural. When Paul Anderson started his green Ford Ranger at the Shell gas station in Williams, it was the last time he appeared on any surveillance footage. Paul, 34 years old, an electrical maintenance technician living in Flagstaff, grew up in hard-working blue-collar neighborhoods with steady routines and strict workplace rules. He saw short nighttime drives along Route 66 as a habit that helped him escape the everyday pressure, and this trip was prepared in his usual simple, tidy way that matched his careful personality. According to the gas station receipt, Paul bought a hot coffee and a bottle of water, then drove out of Williams at 9:47 p.m., heading toward Seligman exactly as he had told his family beforehand that he wouldn't go far and would call when he reached his stop. On the road connecting the two towns, Paul's headlights were one of the very few moving lights passing through one of the least monitored sections of the route, where highway cameras became scarce, and old mile markers were the only companions in the dark. A night shift truck driver later told Highway Patrol that he saw a Ford Ranger pulled off crookedly onto the shoulder near an abandoned rest area a few miles east of Seligman, with the headlights still on and the vehicle slightly tilted, as if the driver had stopped momentarily to check something. There was no one visible around the area, no signs of a struggle or any noise loud enough to make him stop, and in the context of a late night on a deserted highway, he continued on his route without any particular suspicion. Meanwhile, back in Flagstaff, Paul's family was waiting for the usual confirmation call that he had arrived safely, a habit Paul had never broken in all his years of shift work and frequent late-night travel. The phone didn't ring. Messages went unread. The prolonged silence began to worry them. Time passed until nearly midnight with no response of any kind. By the next morning, when Paul didn't show up for work on time and no one could reach him, the unusual situation turned into a clear red flag. The family called friends, checked familiar places, hoping for a minor signal issue or device problem, but everyone confirmed they had heard nothing from Paul since the previous evening. When the clock approached noon on August 13th and every sign of contact had completely vanished, the Anderson family officially reported him missing to local law enforcement, opening a case that no one realized would lead to a chain of bizarre and shocking events on the very same desolate stretch of road Paul had driven into on the night he disappeared without a trace. When the missing person report was forwarded to the Arizona Highway Patrol, a patrol unit was immediately dispatched to sweep the sections of road Paul Anderson could have traveled on his westward journey along Route 66. And in the early afternoon of August 13, 2019, a highway patrol officer spotted the green Ford Ranger sitting motionless on the shoulder a few miles east of Seligman, standing out clearly in the empty, barren desert landscape where vehicles rarely stopped. The vehicle was pulled off the roadway only a short distance, but was not obscured by brush or terrain, and the daytime lighting conditions made it an easily identifiable object against the dry red earth. The officer approached from the rear, following standard safety procedure, and confirmed the license plate matched the information provided by the family. From the initial observation, the body of the vehicle showed no signs of heavy impact. The glass remained intact. There were no fresh scratches, and no point indicated a collision, vandalism, or confrontation. The driver's side door was slightly ajar but undamaged, hinges intact, lock showing no signs of forced entry. Inside the cabin, the interior was tidy and undisturbed, the seat in its normal position, and no items were out of place in a way that suggested hasty behavior or resistance. During the preliminary inspection, the officer collected the remaining items in the vehicle for documentation. A dead smartphone found under the driver's seat, a cold paper coffee cup bearing the logo of the store on Railroad Avenue in Williams, a fuel purchase receipt timed at 9:39 p.m., and a partially folded Route 66 map left on the passenger seat. Although these personal items were present, none of them provided any clear clue about what might have happened after Paul left Williams. Examination of the area around the vehicle also yielded no specific leads. The ground was hard and dry from high temperatures, making it nearly impossible to identify footprints or tire tracks. Any faint impressions in the dust around the wheels were likely the natural result of desert wind or vehicles that had passed by in previous days. No scattered belongings, clothing, bag, or any item suggesting an emergency were found. There were no drag marks, no unusual depressions in the soil, and no strange fluid stains around the vehicle. When compiling the initial findings, the patrol unit concluded that the condition of the vehicle was entirely consistent with a driver stopping temporarily, stepping out for personal or mechanical reasons, then disappearing without any clear direction of travel. This provided sufficient grounds to activate the procedure for searching a missing person in a remote area. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office was notified immediately, along with the precise coordinates where the vehicle was located, and from there a rapid coordination network quickly formed between the Highway Patrol and local search and rescue units in the area. Survey teams were divided into multiple directions, including along the old railroad tracks running parallel to Route 66, the informal trails branching into the lowlands to the south, and the sparsely populated areas on the outskirts of Seligman. The approach was built on the assumption that Paul may have left the vehicle while experiencing disorientation, exhaustion, or a need to seek nearby assistance. Locations rated as high probability were concentrated mainly within a few miles radius of the scene, where a person on foot could reasonably travel in a short time before extreme heat and rugged terrain became limiting factors. The roadside and adjacent wilderness sweep did not reveal any specific detail that would establish Paul's initial direction of movement. No distinct footprints, no scratch marks on the dry soil, and no physical evidence of disturbance were found. The patrol unit documented the scene, sealed the vehicle, and transferred all items inside to headquarters for storage in Paul Anderson's official missing person file. The search perimeter continued to expand under Yavapai County authority, with the goal of encompassing the entire area a person could have traversed from the time Paul was last recorded in Williams until the vehicle was discovered, laying the foundation for a larger-scale search effort in the following days, if no further signs emerged to narrow down the theories surrounding his disappearance. When Paul Anderson's Ford Ranger was towed from its roadside position and all related information was handed over to the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, search forces were mobilized immediately on a scale appropriate for a missing person case in a remote, low-surveillance section of highway. A rescue team helicopter was dispatched from Prescott, flying along the route from the last recorded camera point at Williams to the location where the vehicle was found, using infrared observation equipment and high-resolution cameras to look for heat signatures or any unusual movement on the ground. At the same time, a drone unit was deployed from ground teams stationed at 3 different locations around the Seligman area, forming an aerial scanning network that focused on dissected terrain, seasonal wash channels, and low-lying depressions that could be hidden from view of the roadway. On the ground line, the K9 unit began scent tracking from the exact position of the vehicle, following wind direction and the road alignment. But the dry ground, hot wind, and the time that had passed since the previous night had almost completely erased scent molecules, severely reducing detection effectiveness, and forcing the team to move in expanding circular patterns, in hopes of picking up any faint remaining trace on low vegetation or in the rare shaded spots. Not only official personnel but also the local communities around Ash, Fork, Seligman, and Williams joined the search effort, with volunteers bringing water, walkie-talkies, and topographic maps to sweep open land areas, old rest stops, abandoned rest areas, and dirt roads that had once served as secondary routes during previous tourist seasons. During the first 3 days, the search radius was concentrated within 4 miles of the scene, as this was judged to be a reasonable distance. A disoriented person, or someone with a minor health issue, could walk. But when no signs were found, the radius was expanded to 8 miles, then 12 miles, bringing in a second helicopter and additional drone teams to cover the broader desert expanse. Hundreds of images captured by aerial devices were reviewed by analysts, who flagged every potential point of interest: unusual light streaks, color anomalies against the soil, or odd shapes that might be clothing or personal items. But when ground teams reached those locations, every one was identified as a natural feature or old tourist trash, unrelated to Paul. During the search, a few objects were found near bushes or along wash edges, but were all determined not to belong to Paul. Rusted metal fragments, an empty water bottle, and a piece of decayed fabric of a type used years earlier by long-distance hikers. The K9 teams redirected to trails commonly used by wildlife in the area in hopes of finding human footprints, but when the compression marks in the soil were analyzed, specialists confirmed most were made by mule deer, wolves, or coyotes. In the second week, the search expanded northwest into areas with more complex terrain featuring numerous fissures and natural rock alcove entrances. Rescue teams had to use safety ropes and lighting equipment to inspect alcoves extending several meters deep where visibility from outside was blocked, but all were empty, containing only organic debris or signs of animal habitation. Helicopters also conducted low-altitude flights over zones rated as high risk for someone becoming trapped. Yet infrared cameras detected no heat source large enough to indicate human presence. A search group even systematically checked the old railroad line running parallel to Route 66, where many derelict structures could have served as temporary shelter for Paul, but no valuable investigative leads were recorded there either. Throughout the 3 weeks of active deployment, no new tips came from local residents or passing drivers. No physical evidence at the scene or in the surrounding area indicated Paul left the vehicle under emergency conditions, and no findings suggested criminal activity such as a struggle, abduction, or traces of another vehicle. The final search summary report noted that none of the initial possibilities could be confirmed, and continuing to expand the search area was not feasible without any data to guide prioritization of a focal zone. When all active search efforts yielded no results, and the time since Paul was reported missing exceeded the standard window for viable rescue operations, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office officially classified Paul Anderson's disappearance as a cold case, meaning all field search operations ceased, and the case was archived as unsolved due to a complete lack of data proving any specific scenario involving the missing person on this desolate stretch of Route 66. Nearly 4 years after Paul Anderson was reported missing on the desolate stretch of road between Williams and Seligman, an unexpected event occurred in the early morning of June 3, 2023, when a driver from Holbrook was traveling along Highway 180 toward the center of town and spotted a figure staggering along the edge of the road. The man's gait was so unsteady that the driver immediately slowed down, fearing the person might collapse right in the middle of the roadway at any moment. As the distance closed, he could see it was a man in extremely dire condition. Clothes torn to shreds and caked with desert dust, skin dry, cracked and ashen gray, bare feet scraped and bleeding, body skeletal and emaciated, as though he had been exhausted for a very long time, long matted hair, and a face so gaunt it was impossible to determine his exact age. The man walked with obvious effort just to stay upright, every step trembling, his left hand clutching an indistinct object as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The driver got out of his vehicle, approached, and saw clearly that the man barely responded to questions, breathing heavily, eyes not fully open, and voice broken as he tried to force out a few unclear words. Realizing the man's physical condition might be life-threatening, the driver decided not to wait for an ambulance. Instead, he lifted him into the passenger seat and drove straight to the Holbrook Police Department, the nearest agency that could provide emergency medical support and handle a case of severe physical collapse. Upon arrival, the on-duty officers immediately moved the man to the temporary medical aid area and called for medical personnel to conduct a rapid assessment. While medics checked vital signs, blood pressure, dehydration level, and external injuries, an officer responsible for identification used an integrated fingerprint scanner in the internal system to verify identity. Within seconds, the screen displayed a 100% match with the archived record of an individual reported missing nearly 4 years earlier. Paul Anderson, resident of Flagstaff, subject of a large-scale search effort by multiple rescue units that had ultimately yielded no results. After cross-checking the name, age, old identification photo, and additional identifiers in the file, the officer officially documented that the man brought to Holbrook PD was indeed Paul Anderson, the same individual who had vanished under inexplicable circumstances on Route 66 inches August of 2019. This information was quickly relayed to the shift commander, triggering a series of procedural steps for receiving a long-term missing citizen who appeared to have been subjected to possible deprivation of personal liberty. As medical staff conducted a more thorough evaluation, they recorded a series of abnormal signs on Paul's body, indicating he had endured a prolonged period of severe deprivation. Deep indentations around his wrists and ankles that were not random injuries, but consistent with long-term restraint using hard materials, layered scars across his shoulders, back, and wrists suggesting repeated scraping, impact, or friction. Scalp and facial skin showing signs of severe malnutrition, pronounced muscle atrophy, and a mental state of extreme stress with slow responses to sound or movement around him. These findings compelled the on-duty unit to assess that Paul could be the victim of serious criminal conduct involving long-term restriction of personal freedom. This matter exceeded the jurisdiction of a municipal police department. Per protocol, any indication that a citizen had been unlawfully confined for an extended period or transported across multiple jurisdictions required immediate notification to state or federal authorities. While Paul continued to receive IV fluids, caloric support, and internal organ checks to assess the extent of bodily damage, Holbrook PD prepared an electronic report sent to the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, the agency that had originally handled Paul's missing person case. The report detailed the victim's condition, fingerprint identification results, critical health status, and suspicious features related to restraint marks on the body. Simultaneously, Holbrook PD sent an urgent notification to the FBI field office in Phoenix requesting evaluation of potential federal elements, particularly if the victim had been held and moved across multiple county jurisdictions. Paul Anderson's file, previously archived as a cold case, was switched from closed to reactivated status, and all data related to his disappearance was pulled into the system for comprehensive re-examination. The intake report for the victim was completed with specific details regarding time, location, the person who found him, and Paul's physical and mental condition upon arrival at the station. The municipal police department also photographed his body to preserve initial evidence of his condition at the time of appearance. All of this data was sealed according to regulation to ensure integrity for future verification. Given the impossible to ignore abnormal signs of injury and prolonged emaciation, Paul's reappearance after nearly 4 years missing not only revived the entire previously fruitless search effort, but also created an urgent need to determine the cause of his extreme deterioration and panic to the point that he could not clearly provide information himself. As a direct consequence, Paul Anderson's case was upgraded from an unexplained disappearance to a matter of a criminal nature, beginning an official process to examine the possibility that he had been deprived of liberty for an extended period and subjected to conditions beyond any natural hypothesis that could explain the situation. At the medical facility where Paul Anderson was transferred immediately after appearing at the Holbrook Police Department, a team of doctors and technicians was mobilized to conduct a comprehensive examination, starting with basic vital signs and expanding to in-depth assessments to determine the state of his body after an extended period of unknown whereabouts. The first blood test results showed severely low blood glucose levels, low protein concentration, and clear signs of prolonged malnutrition, evidenced by significant muscle mass loss and near-zero subcutaneous fat density. Examination of the abdomen, rib cage, and soft tissues around the spine revealed multiple abnormal indentations, indicating muscle mass loss due to energy deficiency lasting more than a year. Examination of the scalp and epidermis showed dry, brittle hair structure and uneven hair loss, commonly seen in cases of long-term micronutrient deficiency or in individuals held in conditions lacking proper hygiene and light exposure. For the skeletal system, X-rays were taken of the entire chest, arms, legs, and spine to more clearly outline the injuries Paul had endured. Doctors noted at least 6 ribs that had been fractured but healed on their own without medical intervention, resulting in misaligned callus formation and mild deformation of the chest cavity. The finger joints and wrist bones showed signs of repeated microtrauma, typically resulting from prolonged pulling force or intense friction. The left ankle exhibited chronic inflammation, likely formed from being tied or held fixed for an extended period, causing continuous strain on the surrounding soft tissue. Several old wounds on the forearms and calves showed signs of mild infection that had since healed over, but the material that caused the wounds left characteristic tearing patterns of poorly finished metal, commonly seen in improvised items such as galvanized wire, bent nails, or sharp edges of rusted metal surfaces. Examination of the skin around the wrists and ankles was the most critical part of determining the nature of the case. Doctors recorded multiple deep indentations encircling the right and left wrists. The indentations were uneven but showed repeating cyclic patterns, indicating restraint with hard, narrow material over a long period. The skin in these areas had thickened abnormally due to prolonged friction, interspersed with skin tears that left dark scars distributed in unnatural circular patterns. At the ankles, the indentations were even more pronounced, deeper, and in some spots the skin was so thin that discoloration of the underlying fibrous tissue was visible. All of these signs were inconsistent with any random injuries a person might sustain in a wilderness environment. Instead, they clearly reflected a state of being bound or fixed in a specific position for many months, even years. Evaluation of the muscular system revealed obvious muscle atrophy in the thighs, calves, and upper arms, indicating prolonged restriction of movement. Paul's body had so little adipose tissue that most of the skeletal framework was clearly visible through the skin, reflecting chronic energy deficiency and a nutritionally poor diet. Electrolyte testing showed lower than normal potassium and sodium levels, commonly seen in cases of prolonged dehydration and mineral deficiency, suggesting a harsh survival environment over a long time without adequate food sources. During the oral examination, the oral and maxillofacial specialist noted uneven tooth enamel wear and signs of chronic gum inflammation, consistent with eating hard foods or lacking hygiene conditions for an extended period. Liver and kidney function tests also showed abnormal values, reflecting prolonged nutritional imbalance. When compiling all the examination results, the medical team determined that Paul had undergone a period of severe restriction of physical freedom, with unmistakable signs of long-term confinement. The untreated old injuries, the degree of nutritional deficit, the overall state of emaciation, and the restraint marks around the wrists and ankles all pointed to one unified conclusion. Paul had been held captive for a minimum of several years, under living conditions so harsh that they left clear consequences across his entire body. There was no injury consistent with the hypothesis of freely wandering, getting lost, self-inflicted harm, or encountering an accident in a natural environment. Everything reflected prolonged intervention and control by an external force or individual. Comparing the medical findings with Paul's missing person file, the team of doctors concluded that his reappearance could not be the result of a spontaneous incident, but was typical of a prolonged kidnapping and captivity case, supported by sufficient scientific evidence to establish that he had spent many years without adequate nutrition, without access to medical care, and with severely restricted movement. This required law enforcement to treat the matter as an organized criminal act, or at least one carried out with clear intent to maintain control over Paul's body for an extended period. During the comprehensive medical evaluation, a team of clinical psychologists was brought in to conduct a separate examination to determine the extent of the psychological impact Paul Anderson had endured after many years, missing and reappearing in a state of extreme physical depletion. Right from the first contact, the specialists noted a series of characteristic signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, an exaggerated startle response to even small noises, avoidance of direct eye contact, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding environment, as though always anticipating an attack, and a persistently elevated state of hypervigilance that did not decrease even in a completely safe setting. When asked basic questions such as his name, age, place of residence, or current physical condition, Paul answered slowly in a hoarse, weak voice, often pausing mid-sentence, as though he had to search for words in fragmented memory. Some abnormal reactions included clenching his hands tightly, covering his wrists, or staring fixedly at one spot on the wall, indicating the presence of painful memories that he could not yet verbalize. Paul's ability to recall events in a linear fashion was severely impaired. When asked to describe a simple sequence of events, he could not arrange them in chronological order. Instead, he referred to disjointed, fragmented images and repeatedly used words that evoked feelings of being watched, being locked up, or being confined in space, showing that his memory structure had been disrupted by prolonged traumatic experience. This led the team to rule out standard interviewing methods, since asking Paul to recount what happened could trigger re-traumatization and worsen his psychological instability. Instead, they recommended a layered interviewing technique, a method commonly used with victims of long-term captivity or psychological control. This technique does not require the victim to recount the entire sequence of events in order. It focuses on activating memory through small thematic clusters, such as the surrounding environment, sounds, lighting, food portions, rest periods, or estimated time markers, based on cues like weather changes or external noises. Through an extended observation session, the team noted that Paul reacted strongly to the closing of a door, showed signs of panic when hearing the sound of a lock or metal clanging, while displaying temporary calm when near soft lighting and open space. These responses aligned closely with profiles of victims who had been held in confined or narrow spaces with limited light and tightly controlled exposure to the external environment. In addition, Paul showed a tendency to wait for a signal or command before performing simple actions such as drinking water or moving to another spot in the room, a significant indicator that he had undergone a period of systematic behavioral control. The specialists did not observe clear signs of paranoia or severe cognitive disorder, meaning Paul remained aware of reality, but his ability to express, analyze, and organize memories was significantly reduced due to the effects of prolonged psychological control. Emotional response testing revealed that Paul was strongly triggered by words associated with confinement: closed, held, locked, or in the room, and showed a slight tremor when a tall male figure passed by the doorway, indicating a deep association between certain physical characteristics of a captor and intense fear. Another noted point was that Paul could hardly maintain sleep for more than 20 minutes. He would frequently jolt awake in a state of panic, covered in cold sweat, eyes wide open, breathing rapid, classic signs of recurrent nightmares. The experts identified this as a typical PTSD symptom in victims of long-term isolation or confinement, especially when normal day-night cycles were absent. From all the collected data, the psychology team concluded that Paul had been subjected to prolonged psychological manipulation or control, including restrictions on behavior, interaction, movement, and likely frequent threats. When analyzing the long-term injuries alongside the psychiatric responses, the specialists assessed that Paul may have lived in a state of chronic anxiety so intense that it formed automatic survival mechanisms, making it impossible for him to respond like a free person when exposed to a normal environment. Based on the evaluation results, the team recommended the following information-gathering process: slow-paced interviewing, avoidance of direct questions, avoidance of immediate requests for detailed descriptions, use of anchored recall methods by employing neutral images or sounds to activate memory without causing harm, ensuring an open space and avoiding metallic sounds, allowing breaks between each cluster of questions, and absolutely no use of any coercive or pressure-based techniques. This approach was considered the most appropriate for a victim showing signs of many years of psychological control, helping ensure that he could gradually provide information without re-triggering trauma or slipping into a state of panic. In the first interviews conducted using the layered technique, Paul Anderson began providing fragmented pieces of memory about the moment of the abduction on Route 66. The initial fragments were vague, but consistent enough to allow investigators to reconstruct the perpetrator's approach phase before Paul was subdued. Paul recalled that on the night of August 12, 2019, when he pulled over on a stretch of road a few miles from Seligman to check a small noise coming from under the vehicle, headlights from another vehicle appeared from behind, casting his long shadow across the dry ground. The other vehicle slowed down very gradually, stopping about 20 feet behind his Ford Ranger. There was no shout, no immediate inquiry, only the low idling engine sound that made the nighttime desert atmosphere unusually tense. Paul said he saw a man step out from the driver's side tall, slightly hunched, walking slowly toward him, one hand raised as if to reassure, then speaking in a low, deep voice that he too had a similar breakdown and was asking for help holding a light or borrowing a tool. At that moment, Paul had no clear reason to suspect anything, because a request for assistance on a sparsely traveled road was not unusual, and the man's initial behavior carried no threat. However, Paul said that the instant he bent down to open the car door and reach for the flashlight in the glove compartment, a very fast movement appeared right behind his right shoulder. He didn't have time to turn before something hard was pressed tightly against the underside of his neck, causing an immediate, overwhelming jolt that clouded his mind. When asked what the object was, Paul described the sensation as cold, heavy, and rough-edged, like the metal butt of a device or tool. Another fragment of memory showed the attacker using an arm to lock around his neck and pushing him toward the rear of the vehicle, causing him to lose balance and collapse to the ground while his breathing was constricted. Paul clearly remembered the crunch of gravel under his knees as he was dragged, along with the feeling of rope or binding cord being cinched tightly around his wrists. Just seconds later, an action so swift that he was almost unable to react. When Paul tried to struggle, the man pressed a tubular device directly against his side, delivering a powerful electric shock that caused him to lose all muscular control. Investigators recognized that this description matched the characteristics of a compact, high-power stun device capable of incapacitating a person without causing immediate severe injury. Paul said that while lying on his side on the ground, he could still feel the headlights of the attacker's vehicle shining on his face, but his vision was blurred by the shock and the dust rising from the road. When he forced his eyes open, he made out the hazy outline of the vehicle, a mid-size SUV, dark color, with a roof rack, not an ordinary pickup truck. Paul emphasized that he heard the rear door open and felt himself being lifted, his body largely paralyzed from the electric shock and the binding. He was shoved into the rear cargo area of the SUV, where there was a hard, flat board or surface that caused his body to slam down hard upon impact. When he tried to look around, he could only distinguish the smell of old metal and a faint odor of motor oil. There were no side windows, or if there were, they had been completely covered with dark material. As the vehicle began to move, Paul described the characteristic jolting and tilting sensations of dirt road travel, not like the asphalt surface of Route 66. He remembered the vehicle turning off the highway very quickly, the engine roaring as it accelerated and continued over rough, uneven sections that produced hard jolts, causing his head to strike the surface beneath him multiple times. During that period, Paul became aware that he could no longer see streetlights or hear other traffic, indicating the perpetrator had taken him into a remote area with no passing vehicles. When investigators asked him to estimate the duration of the transport, Paul could not give an exact figure due to loss of awareness after the first few minutes, but he described the sense that time stretched longer than an hour, and that at least twice the vehicle passed over extremely bumpy sections that caused him to slide from his original position. Paul recalled that the temperature inside the cargo area gradually rose, with no airflow or outside air coming in, suggesting the vehicle had been running for a long time and the rear compartment was fully isolated. He also noted the sounds of metal clanging and objects rolling inside the compartment, possibly equipment or tools belonging to the perpetrator. In one brief moment, when the vehicle slowed to cross a large bump, Paul saw a sliver of light leaking through a small gap above, through which he glimpsed a portion of the sky without any urban glow, only deep black, and a few faint points of light. This led investigators to determine that the transport route very likely left the Route 66 area and went deeper into the desert terrain to the north or northeast of Arizona. The data Paul provided, though fragmented, still formed a clear sequence of events. The perpetrator approached by pretending to ask for help, then used a hard object together with an electric stun device to subdue him, bound the victim with rope or sharp-edged binding cord, placed him in the rear cargo area of a dark-colored SUV with a roof rack, and transported him for an extended period over uneven terrain, far from populated areas and main roads. Although Paul could not describe the exact direction or distance traveled, the way he described the sounds, vibrations, and temperature changes inside the vehicle was sufficient for investigators to conclude that he had been taken out of the range of the highway's stable traffic characteristics and deep into an area of abandoned roads or secondary tracks, leading to isolated regions. In the extended interviews conducted over many hours using the non-linear recall method, Paul Anderson began describing the structure of the confinement location where he was taken after the prolonged transport in the rear cargo area of the SUV. He could not pinpoint the exact moment the vehicle stopped, but he remembered the sensation of being dragged out, his legs too weak to stand firmly, and the ground beneath his feet having the smoothness of dried dirt rather than gravel or concrete. Paul said the perpetrator gripped his bound wrists tightly and forced him to walk toward a narrow descending passage. The ground sloped gently, not too deep, but enough to make his body sway with each step. He recalled that the air in that area felt thicker, with a smell of damp earth mixed with rusting metal and the distinctive heavy odor of a long, unventilated enclosed space. Paul described the mouth of the tunnel as an iron frame set level with the ground, resembling a manhole cover, but with hinges and a crossbar. When opened, it produced a dry, prolonged metallic screech, as though it had not been lubricated for a long time. When he was pushed down, the only light that entered was a thin streak behind him until the door was slammed shut, leaving the space in near absolute darkness. In subsequent statements, Paul described the lighting system inside the tunnel. Not ordinary bulbs, but low-wattage lights running on weak power, sometimes flickering, emitting a yellowish glow that barely illuminated a few feet ahead. He said this light likely came from batteries or a small generator because a low, steady hum appeared at various times, but not continuously, sometimes complete silence, sometimes a faint vibration under the ground. The specialist team noted this description and determined that the power source was most likely not connected directly to the main electrical grid. Paul recounted that the tunnel felt cold at night but stiflingly hot during the day, with distinct temperature changes over time, suggesting the tunnel was not deeply buried but close to the surface or covered by only a thin layer of earth, allowing the interior conditions to be directly affected by the desert climate. Low humidity, heavy air odor, and poor ventilation were consistent details throughout his account. Paul described the size of the confinement space as a small rectangular room, about 2 footsteps wide and 4 to 5 footsteps long. The floor was hard-packed dirt. The walls felt like rough wood or old plywood, and in some places he touched cold metal surfaces. He said that every time he leaned against the wall, the sound echoed as though striking an empty cavity or space behind it. This prompted investigators to note that the structure might be a modular room system, or built with cheap materials placed over a metal frame. When asked about the door system, Paul described a door directly in front of him, made of iron, heavy, with hinges that made a very loud noise every time it opened. Paul clearly remembered the strong clack each time the lock engaged, suggesting the use of a large horizontal metal bolt and an external padlock. Inside the tunnel there was a cylindrical ventilation pipe set high near the ceiling, about 4 to 6 inches in diameter, leading outward but covered with something like metal mesh or a shield plate, which caused external sounds to enter only as faint whistling wind, almost impossible to determine direction. Paul emphasized that he once heard strong wind blowing through the pipe, and from that concluded the confinement was not in a completely sealed area like a warehouse or shipping container, but was placed almost directly beneath the ground. Surface. On several occasions, he heard distant engine sounds, wheels grinding on gravel, and occasionally metal objects clanging in open space. These details led the interview team to infer that the confinement area might be near a dirt road or a location with intermittent mechanical activity, such as a scrapyard, an abandoned construction site, or an area where a generator was used irregularly. Paul further recounted that during the first many months, he was forced to perform heavy labor inside the area near the tunnel. He described being made to dig additional trenches along the walls, transport dirt and rocks using metal buckets, and manually move heavy wooden planks, probably to expand or reinforce the tunnel structure. Each time, he was led outside into a narrow space, hands still bound or movement restricted, and under the direct supervision of the perpetrator. Many times, Paul had to scrape dirt with his bare hands, resulting in the deep scratches that have now left faint scars on his forearms and fingernails broken horizontally, consistent with the doctor's description. He remembered the soil feeling loose and crumbly, without gravel mixed in, indicating the structure was located in soft, easily dug earth, possibly in a clay-sand mixed region, characteristic of many areas in northern Arizona. When describing the area surrounding the tunnel, Paul said he was once brought outside at night, when he heard desert insects, strong whistling wind, and occasionally a low growl that seemed to come from large animals, possibly coyotes or bobcats. He also recalled that the wind direction usually came from the right side of the tunnel door, which allowed the specialist team to infer that the tunnel door might face south or southeast, where Arizona's summer winds tend to blow during the months Paul described. The sound-related memories also played an important role. Paul remembered frequent metal clanging and irregular generator startups, suggesting the equipment was poorly maintained and operated only as needed. External sounds were not rich, no traffic noise, no voices of people, which led him to believe the confinement was in a deeply isolated inland area, far from any populated zone. He recalled small engine sounds, not large trucks or passenger vehicles, but possibly the type used for small construction sites. In some descriptions, Paul said he felt faint vibrations under the ground, similar to a compressor operating not too far away. From these descriptions, acoustic analysis technicians suggested the area might be near temporary mechanical equipment or a location with small-scale machinery repair activity. When asked about natural light, Paul confirmed he only saw real light during the times he was forced to work outside the tunnel, and the light always had a yellow or orange tint, with very low intensity, indicating he was only brought out at dusk or before dawn. He never saw strong sunlight, which supported the hypothesis that the perpetrator deliberately avoided letting him experience conditions that could help him determine the time of day. Paul described the interior layout of the tunnel as a single room with no side branches, no additional exits, a simple ventilation system with one large pipe, and a smaller one placed near the floor to maintain minimal airflow. Paul believed the distinct temperature changes throughout the day helped him distinguish morning from evening even without seeing the sun. When these details were compiled, law enforcement was able to identify key characteristics of the location: a shallow tunnel with an iron door, a structure assembled from boards or thin metal, poor ventilation, situated in soft soil, near light mechanical sound sources, and directly affected by desert winds. Through Paul's testimony, the overall structure of the confinement site emerged as a hand-built space, combining wood, rusted metal, and packed earth, lacking any amenities, insulation, or proper ventilation, reflecting an improvised detention facility that had been maintained long enough to serve the purpose of completely isolating the victim from the outside world. In the subsequent interviews, when Paul Anderson's mental state had stabilized further, he began to describe more clearly the control process and communication model that the perpetrator maintained throughout the period of captivity, a tightly organized, repetitive system that remained almost unchanged over time, showing that the person carrying it out had a highly compulsive behavioral control mindset. Paul said that right from the first days, the perpetrator established a mandatory daily routine for him, not based on real time but on suggestive actions, such as the sound of the door lock opening, the metallic clang of a bowl being set down hard on the floor, or the heavy, approaching footsteps of the perpetrator standing just outside the tunnel. This cycle consisted of 3 phases: delivering food, demanding labor, and checking condition. Each time food was provided, the perpetrator spoke no words except for a short sound resembling a command, and Paul was forced to stand up, turn his back to the door, and place his hands in front of his chest in the exact posture that had been imposed from the very first days. If he did not perform the movement correctly or moved in the wrong direction, the perpetrator struck the wall hard with a solid object as a warning or pressed the stun device against his arm, instantly creating a fear reflex. This man maintained a clear and consistent punishment system. Paul recounted that every time he resisted an order or carried out a labor demand imprecisely, he was punished by being left in handcuffs longer, having drinking water restricted, or being forced to kneel for extended periods. On days considered non-compliant, the perpetrator escalated the level of coercion by leaving the lights on continuously inside the tunnel, causing Paul to lose sleep and fall into a state of confusion. The perpetrator rarely used excessive direct violence, instead relying mainly on the repetition of punitive measures to form conditioned reflexes, forcing Paul to obey commands to avoid extreme pain or exhaustion. In the early period, Paul did not understand the purpose of the forced labor. But after a few weeks, he realized the perpetrator was building or expanding a structure adjacent to the confinement tunnel. Paul was assigned tasks such as carrying dirt, clearing materials, digging trenches, and moving heavy wooden planks, usually at night or before dawn. During this process, the perpetrator always stood a few feet away, watching every movement and ready to grab the binding cord again whenever Paul slowed down or stopped. There was absolutely no two-way conversation. The perpetrator used only single-syllable commands such as go, dig, place, and if Paul appeared confused, he immediately increased the level of threat with the stun device. One of the strangest elements Paul recounted was the perpetrator's demand that he focus on drawing maps. This began roughly a few months after captivity, when Paul was brought out of the tunnel at night to a better-lit area where a small wooden table stood with a large piece of cardboard on it. The perpetrator placed colored sheets of paper in front of Paul, many of them red, along with pencils and fine-tipped markers. He spoke only one word: draw. Paul did not know what to draw, but every time he sketched any random line, the perpetrator pointed to strange symbols on a sample sheet: long straight lines, sharp angles, empty spaces marked with swirling strokes. He wanted Paul to copy those lines, then change their positions and order. Paul described that the perpetrator pointed to road segments, seemingly requiring him to recreate some kind of route map in which points were marked in red and connected by uneven lines. When Paul drew incorrectly or omitted details, the perpetrator snatched the paper away, threw it to the ground, and ordered him to redraw it, sometimes for hours on end. Paul said the maps covered in red lines that he was forced to recreate were collected by the perpetrator into a wooden box, locked, and taken away. Although Paul did not understand the purpose, he clearly sensed the perpetrator's obsession with linear symbols, spatial rotation directions, and repeatedly drawn map structures. The specialist team identified this as the red route pattern, the name Paul used to describe the series of red-marked instructions drawn multiple times under the perpetrator's supervision. These behaviors showed an individual with a high degree of control thinking, wanting to impose order on everything, including space and paths. Based on Paul's testimony about how the perpetrator moved within the confinement area, Paul described him always following a fixed trajectory, never standing close to the victim for long, and always positioning his body between Paul and the exit, as though someone who had rehearsed this behavior many times. Nearly every action of the perpetrator followed repetition. Even footsteps, the same way of closing the door, the same lock-clack sound, steady, deep breathing that did not change even when Paul was being punished. He did not talk, did not explain, did not threaten verbally, showing a coercion pattern based on behavior rather than language. These details led to the assessment that the perpetrator exhibited strong psychological traits centered on an absolute need for control in a closed environment, relying on punishment and repetition to eliminate the victim's will to resist, while using map symbols and red route lines as a form of personal obsession or specific goal. In the interviews that stretched over many days, Paul Anderson began providing the clearest sequence of memories about the moment he escaped, details that later became the foundation for investigators to determine the actual field location of the confinement site. Paul remembered that on one night with an unusually strong smell of damp earth, when the temperature inside the tunnel fluctuated abnormally as though the outside air was swinging wildly, The entire plywood structure above the ceiling shook continuously. The first sound he heard was the wind howling fiercely through the ventilation pipe, so strong that the gust blew straight down to the ground, carrying dry dust cascading from the ceiling. Then came a deep, rumbling crash, not mechanical but like the collapse of something large being battered by wind. From the corner of the tunnel where the metal support frame was anchored, he felt powerful shock waves transmitted down to the dirt floor, making the tunnel walls pulse in rhythm. The tiny cracks that had only appeared around the joints between the plywood and metal braces now widened, shedding small chunks. Paul said that at that moment, he understood the tunnel structure had been weakened by a storm or a similar event, creating the first gap in many years, allowing him to see a faint streak of light seeping through the plywood layer. The continuous shaking had pushed the cover plate attached to the mouth of the large ventilation pipe aside by a few inches, enough for Paul to realize it was the only possible escape route. Paul described this ventilation pipe as a cylindrical metal tube, about 10 to 12 inches in diameter, thickly coated with dust on the outside, and inside mottled with rust patches and long scratch marks along the walls. Because it had been neglected for years, the bolts holding the cover frame had worn down, causing the iron grill to rattle lightly whenever strong wind blew. He said that during that collapse night, the high wind had bent the cover inward, creating a gap just wide enough for him to thread his wrist through. With his skeletal, scraped hands, Paul twisted the grill with every ounce of remaining strength, feeling each small metal bar snap apart. He lost track of how long it took to create a wide enough opening. He only remembered the burning pain in his palms from friction against the metal. Once the ventilation pipe was open enough, Paul pushed his arm in first to check the depth. The pipe slanted upward, not vertical, and this gave him the only chance to crawl through. The hardest part was his shoulders. Paul had to twist his body so sharply that his shoulder bones nearly scraped against the pipe walls, feeling the rusting metal rake layers of skin. He tried to force air into his lungs to shrink his body size as he squeezed through, his breathing ragged because the space was so tight that his chest was heavily compressed every time he tried to inch upward. He guessed the crawling process lasted at least several minutes, but the sense of time seemed distorted. Every time he twisted to avoid narrowed sections of the pipe, his head struck the metal, causing dizziness. Paul recounted that the ventilation pipe did not run straight. It had 3 direction changes, each at roughly 45-degree angles that forced him to stop, rotate his body, and use his knees and elbows as leverage points to push himself up. At the second turn, he clearly felt cool air blowing against his face, carrying the desert wind scent he had not smelled in many years. That was the only signal telling him he was getting closer to the exit. When he reached the crumbly dirt edge at the top of the pipe, Paul used all his strength to push aside the thin layer of soil that wind had blown in. After several shoves, loose dirt fell onto his face, and a large chunk gave way, exposing an opening wide enough for him to crawl the rest of his body out. Once out of the pipe, Paul tumbled down a gentle sandy slope, his body slamming hard onto the mixed clay-sand ground. He did not stand up immediately but lay still, ears filled with the sound of strong wind and, farther off, rolling thunder. When he looked around in the dim light from a moonless sky, he saw a gently sloping terrain. Ahead was a wide-open area with no prominent man-made structures, and behind was a small eroded mound where the ventilation pipe protruded like a wound in the earth. Paul did not recognize any sign of a major road or houses. The terrain consisted of clay-sand soil, low scrub brush, scattered cacti, and the sound of wind blowing strongly across the empty plain. He said the wind blew consistently from his right side, meaning if he stood with his back to the tunnel door, the wind came from the east or southeast. That helped him establish a rough direction of travel because he still retained a vague sense of geography from his free days. Once he determined the direction, Paul began moving up the slope, trying to reach higher ground for better observation, even though his legs were in agony from muscle loss and only held up by sheer will. He did not remember the exact distance traveled, but he described the feeling of spending hours crawling across rough terrain, tripping over rocks, collapsing many times but forcing himself back up because he feared being recaptured. As dawn gradually broke, Paul saw the first sign of human presence. a long gray streak cutting across his field of view, which he later identified as the secondary road leading toward Holbrook. The road surface was not smooth asphalt but mixed with gravel and dust, typical of rural Arizona roads. He headed straight toward it in a state of near-total exhaustion. When he reached the road, Paul said he could only walk along the shoulder because his eyes could no longer judge long distances. He remembered the road surface gradually warming as the sun rose, and the distant sound of a truck engine echoing from a world he had been cut off from for too long. The time from escaping the tunnel until being discovered by the driver could not be precisely determined, but the terrain features gentle sloping ground, clay sand soil, wind blowing from the right. The transition from natural land to a gravel-strewn secondary road all became critical data that helped investigators analyze the field radius. Paul also clearly described his final memory before being rescued. He saw headlights flash in his vision, then his legs went numb, and he heard someone shouting loudly beside him before everything faded into haze. These memory fragments, though incomplete, when combined with actual terrain data from Arizona and seasonal wind patterns, provided law enforcement with the foundation to identify the location of the confinement tunnel and the route Paul traveled until he was brought to the Holbrook Police Department. During the process of collecting evidence from the Holbrook Police Department, investigators received the pieces of paper that Paul Anderson had been clutching tightly in his hand when he was found. They were later examined more closely and determined to belong to the same large set of documents that Paul had been forced to copy during his captivity. The forensic examination team analyzed the material and confirmed that this paper was not standard office paper, but thin craft cardstock with high fiber content, a slightly rough surface, commonly used in small workshops or non-industrial production sites. The red ink on the paper was oil-based marker ink. Molecular structure analysis showed it was not a common retail brand available at supermarkets, but rather a type used for technical marking, capable of withstanding high temperatures and rough surfaces. This suggested the perpetrator had access to industrial supplies or worked in an environment involving material marking. When the entire set of papers retrieved from Paul's hands and from the hospital room where he placed them on the bed in a state of panic was analyzed, investigators identified a total of 17 recurring red symbols, each representing a point that had been heavily marked with thick strokes or circled multiple times. The remainder of the map consisted only of broken, jagged lines extending in the form of routes or continuous sequences of sharp turns. To cross-reference, the map analysis team digitized all the sheets and overlaid them onto real topographic maps of eastern and northeastern Arizona, including the areas around Holbrook, Winslow, the intersections with Joseph City, and the secondary roads leading into the Little Colorado Desert region. GIS technicians used software to format the lines according to the rotation angles that Paul had drawn. Although Paul had been forced to copy the red routes multiple times and had no control over the structure of the paths, the significant repetition in the shape of the curves and turning angles allowed several lines to match real-world maps with notable accuracy. Among the 17 red-marked points, 11 were located near dirt road intersections within the local unpaved road system. 4 were near areas that had once been temporary construction sites or abandoned extraction zones, and 2 were adjacent to federal BLM land, where improvised structures were often left behind. The analysis team compiled a list of 17 suspect locations grouped by category. Group 1 included points near secondary roads connecting Highway 180 and Highway 77, where the terrain featured low, gentle slopes, similar to Paul's description of the area he crawled out into after escaping. Group 2 included points within the clay sand soil region east of Holbrook, consistent with his description of loose, easily dug earth. Group 3 included points near areas that had previously had small-scale mechanical activity, evidenced by echo records and Paul's descriptions of compressor sounds during his years in captivity. Group 4 focused on points with consistent southeast wind patterns, matching the wind direction Paul described. And Group 5 included points in areas capable of concealing small underground structures from aerial detection based on multi-year satellite imagery. After grouping, investigators collected environmental sample data for deeper comparison, including soil moisture, soil type, shrub density, average seasonal wind direction, and distance from each marked point to the nearest traffic route. At the 17 locations, they cross-checked which sites had likely experienced structural collapse incidents in recent years, based on geological analysis and erosion traces. When ranked by degree of match with Paul's testimony regarding terrain, wind, sounds, and tunnel structure, the list narrowed to 5 high-probability points that were most likely locations where the perpetrator had once transferred the victim or constructed one of several related confinement sites. The first point was located near the intersection of a dirt road east of Holbrook, where summer wind patterns matched Paul's description of wind gusts through the ventilation pipe. The second point was situated near an area of soft, easily excavated soil, where the landform fully aligned with his descriptions of digging trenches and manually transporting dirt. The third point was identified near an abandoned construction site, where low-frequency compressor sounds matched the noises Paul had heard. The fourth point was an area with narrow roads used by small vehicles, such as SUVs, showing characteristic turn patterns similar to the red route model Paul had drawn. And the fifth point, the most critical one, was a long stretch of land with thin geological cover, where a shallow tunnel structure was highly likely to have been damaged and weakened by a windstorm, exactly as Paul described. From the comparison of the red-line structures on Paul's hand-drawn maps with digital maps, law enforcement concluded that the red symbols were not random patterns, but a system of victim transfer points, locations the perpetrator had marked as stopping stations, direction change points, or sites for building auxiliary structures. These 5 key points became the central focus of in-depth analysis, providing a data foundation not only for identifying the location of the confinement tunnel, but also for the hypothesis regarding the perpetrator's operational range across the desert region of eastern Arizona. The first red point was selected as the initial target for on-site inspection because it converged the most matching factors between Paul Anderson's testimony and environmental analysis data. The prevailing wind direction from the southeast, clay sand soil that was easy to dig, gently sloping terrain leading down into a shallow valley, and signs of erosion occurring exactly during the period Paul described the tunnel structure shaking violently. The interdisciplinary investigation team consisting of geologists, trace evidence specialists, and a K-9 unit moved to the area located about 14 miles east of the main highway from Holbrook. They used soil pressure measurement devices, combined with satellite data, to identify depressions likely to have once contained a shallow underground structure. When cross-referencing the depth of disturbed soil layers, fine soil without gravel mixed in, exactly the type Paul described when he was forced to dig the tunnel, the technical team concluded that this area had undergone human intervention in the past, but it was not part of any legal construction activity. Ground-penetrating radar units were deployed to scan beneath the surface and detected an anomalous rectangular-shaped mass at a depth of 40 to 60 centimeters, with narrow width of only about 0.8 to 1 meter, length of 2 to 3 meters, and a signal reflection pattern indicating a mixture of wood, metal, and empty space signs, consistent with Paul's description of the confinement tunnel. When the overlying soil layer was excavated, the investigation team discovered numerous broken pieces of plywood with torn edges and twisted metal bars, exactly matching the description of severe shaking during the night the tunnel collapsed. Near the old tunnel entrance area, a piece of rough rope, partially scorched and weathered to rot, was found, along with a segment of hard, cloudy plastic cord that had deformed. The fiber structure of the rope was identical to the type that left deep indentations on Paul's wrists, while the plastic cord had high friction characteristics consistent with long-term fixed restraint. Beneath the soil layer, the inspection team also found a faded piece of fiberglass reinforced tape and a curved metal fragment identified as part of the ventilation grill hinge. All of these matched Paul's detailed description of the tunnel structure. The most critical piece of evidence emerged when the K-9 unit reacted strongly at an area about 3 meters from the tunnel, where there was an unusually deep soil depression. Upon excavation, investigators discovered a small torn piece of gray-brown fabric caked with dry soil. Forensic teams collected samples and took them to the lab for DNA analysis. The results confirmed a complete DNA match with Paul Anderson, proving he had been present at the first red point, an extremely important field confirmation that strongly reinforced the entire testimony concerning the location and confinement structure. The evidence also revealed the existence of a non-permanent confinement system that could be disassembled and moved. The ventilation grill hinge fragment, loose plywood panels, metal support bars that were not anchored into concrete but merely set on compacted dirt. This allowed the investigation team to sketch out a model of a mobile confinement site, a temporary facility assembled from lightweight materials, easy to take apart but sturdy enough to maintain a holding space over a long period. Metal frames and plywood were used in place of permanent construction materials, while ventilation pipes and door locking mechanisms required only detachable components that were simple to install. Erosion traces around the tunnel, including sliding soil layers and wind-cut gullies, indicated that this structure had most likely collapsed during a powerful storm, exactly matching Paul's description of the night he escaped. The investigation team also noted an imbalance in the remaining materials. Some plywood panels were newer and less rotted than others, suggesting the structure had been maintained or partially replaced multiple times, reflecting an intent to keep the confinement point operational for an extended period. The scattered distribution of materials beyond the collapse radius suggested the perpetrator may have dismantled or deliberately moved portions of the structure before abandoning the site. Cross-referencing weather data from Holbrook in 2023, which recorded 2 major windstorms with gusts near 60 miles per hour. The time frame that best matched Paul's description was the storm at the end of May, right before he reappeared along the highway. This provided additional indirect evidence that the night of the tunnel collapse aligned with meteorological records, further reinforcing the accuracy of the victim's testimony. When all traces and evidence at the first red point were compiled, the rope fragments, metal hinge, fabric piece with Paul's DNA, disturbed geological structure, matching wind direction, and soil type consistent with the injuries on his hands, law enforcement concluded that this was one of the primary confinement locations, or a stopover point, in the perpetrator's chain of mobile structures. These findings not only confirmed that Paul's testimony was fully credible, but also opened the possibility that the perpetrator had moved the confinement base across multiple sites within the desert region of eastern Arizona, creating a flexible yet hard-to-detect operational pattern, a highly organized confinement method, relying on rudimentary materials, sufficient to evade detection for many years. The second red point was approached by the investigation team the following week, after analyzing the red route map and determining that this location was likely related to auxiliary activities within the mobile confinement model. The area was located deep within the semi-desert region, accessed via a narrow dirt branch road, where GPS no longer provided stable signal, and digital maps only marked it with an unofficial traverse path symbol. Upon entering the area, the investigation team found an abandoned wooden shack. The structure was leaning but still intact enough to identify its interior layout. The shack was built from scrap wood, plywood, and recycled metal bars, with a roof covered in old corrugated tin that was heavily rusted and punctured in many places. What stood out was that the ground beneath the shack was unnaturally flat, indicating it had been cleared and used for a long period. The smell of rotting wood, old metal, and a fine layer of dust enveloped the space, giving it a feeling of stillness and abandonment. But as the team moved deeper inside, they discovered signs suggesting the place had been used more recently than its appearance indicated. During the search, a forensic team member discovered a small wooden chest hidden under a fallen board. When opened, it contained 3 hardcover notebooks. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwritten text remained legible. The contents of the notebooks consisted of disjointed passages written in red ink and pencil, mostly linear symbols, zigzag lines, heavily filled circles, and short single-syllable command notes such as draw, go, change, up, down. These words matched significantly with Paul's description of how the perpetrator communicated and how he forced him to copy maps. On several other pages, there were short descriptions in a different handwriting with signs of trembling possibly written under stress, including lines such as, "Don't look, don't ask, listen, follow." The presentation, repetitive structure, and behavioral coercion motifs present in the documents were completely consistent with the psychological control characteristics Paul described. This discovery turned the wooden shack from merely a transit point into a possible location the perpetrator used to plan or store documents related to victim control. Continuing the search inside the shack, the forensic team found a cloth rag discarded in a corner, covered in dust but still retaining some hair strands and skin cells. The sample was collected and sent to the laboratory, where DNA analysis results showed not only Paul's DNA, but also the DNA of another individual, a female, approximately 20 to 30 years old, whose identity did not match any records in the Arizona State Database. This was the first time the investigation uncovered evidence suggesting the existence of another victim, creating a serious turning point in the assessment of the crime's scope. In addition to the cloth rag, the inspection team found a piece of irregularly cut fiberglass reinforced tape that contained fabric fibers and old adhesive residue. When the tape surface was scanned with a biological trace detection device, they identified a second cellular sample matching the DNA found on the rag, reinforcing the assumption that the wooden shack had once been a place where another victim was restrained or held briefly. While sweeping the entire space, the fingerprint specialist used display powder and fuming chemicals to check surfaces likely to retain contact traces. On a metal bar used as a door hinge, the investigation team found 3 distinct fingerprints. 2 were smudged and could not be compared, but the third was clear and in good enough condition to be entered into the AFIS system. Initial comparison results showed the fingerprint did not belong to Paul, but partially matched a dataset related to a group of 4 individuals who had previously been investigated for illegally constructing structures on federal public land in the eastern Arizona desert region, although none had ever been convicted, and the records lacked sufficient detail to identify each person's role. This partial match was not enough to conclude the perpetrator's identity, but it was strong enough to redirect the investigation toward a pool of potential subjects who operated over a wide area, had knowledge of the terrain, and had previously used similar materials in building shacks or temporary tunnels. At the western corner of the shack, the investigation team found a small plastic container holding scraps of nylon cord, screws, tape, and wooden stakes used for temporary bracing. This type of material was compatible with the confinement structure found at the first red point, indicating the perpetrator operated a network of mobile sites, rotating materials between locations to avoid detection. The evidence collected at the wooden shack also proved that the confinement activity did not take place solely in a single underground unit, but was supported by multiple auxiliary points where the perpetrator could prepare tools, store coercive maps, and briefly hold victims before transferring them to the main site. The crime scene analysis at the second red point expanded the understanding of the perpetrator's operational mechanism. He did not only control victims through an underground tunnel system, but also maintained flexible auxiliary bases to organize, prepare, and handle documents reflecting a structured, calculated criminal method capable of being repeated with multiple different victims. The evidence collected from the first and second red points compelled the investigation team to expand their analysis toward the purchasing behavior, travel patterns, and daily habits of individuals who had appeared within the suspected operational radius around eastern Arizona, especially those with a history of building illegal structures, buying small but frequent quantities of supplies, or having an unstable residential history. The financial analysis unit began by reviewing transactions related to binding rope, hard nylon cord, fiberglass reinforced tape, cheap plywood, short metal pipes, small bolts, and other materials that had appeared at both investigated sites. They focused particularly on stores in the outskirts of Holbrook, Winslow, and Joseph City, places that did not require buyer registration for basic supplies. When analyzing sales records going back 6 years, the investigation team noticed an unusual recurring pattern of purchases: load-bearing nylon rope, rough textured rope, silver technical tape, rust-resistant paint, and short metal pipes, all matching samples recovered from the crime scenes. The overlap appeared when 3 different stores recorded the name Richard Morrow in their retail transaction systems, accompanied by a temporary address on the outskirts of Winslow. The investigation further expanded to survival products and canned food. Small grocery stores and supply stations recorded regular but moderate purchases of canned goods, including beans, canned meat, sardines, dry crackers, and gallon bottled water. the exact type of food suitable for an environment without electricity or a confined space, such as the shallow tunnel where Paul was held. In many of these transactions, the buyer paid in cash, but interior cameras at two of the stores captured footage of a tall man with a slight hunch in his shoulders, wearing a low-pulled hat and walking with a tilt to the right, the same physical characteristics Paul had described about the perpetrator when he stepped out of the SUV on Route 66. When the behavioral analysis team reviewed records of individuals previously investigated for unauthorized construction on federal land, particularly areas managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the initial list contained 14% names. However, after cross-referencing supply purchase transactions, cell phone location data, travel history, and camera footage of physical appearance, the list was narrowed to 5 individuals. Investigators used federal highway and main dirt road camera systems to compare movement data, including routes near Holbrook, secondary roads near Winslow, and the intersection with Joseph City. From cameras capturing vehicle movement during the time frame of Paul's disappearance, a dark-colored SUV appeared repeatedly in remote areas at hours with virtually no traffic, following a looping arc pattern across the desert, a characteristic that matched the red route Paul had been forced to draw. In particular, this SUV was seen near the location later identified as the first red point during the exact time window when fresh erosion marks appeared on the ground, based on time-stamped satellite imagery. When the camera footage was enlarged, the automatic recognition system highlighted a distinctive feature: a small dent on the left rear door, matching the vague recollection Paul had of the rear compartment during transport. Among the 5 suspects, only Richard Morrow had ever owned an SUV of the same model year, same color, and had maintenance records showing a minor dent repair in the corresponding location. When investigators dug deeper into Morrow's travel habits, the analysis group noticed he frequently left home at dawn, drove into unpopulated areas, and then lost GPS signal for extended periods exactly in the regions where confinement tunnels were believed to exist. Morrow's employment record was nearly blank for many years, with no stable job base, yet he had a history of frequent small-scale purchases of construction materials. Neighbor interviews revealed he lived in isolation, rarely interacted, was sometimes absent for days at a time, but always returned with clothing covered in red dirt, the distinctive soil type found at the discovered tunnel site. Another critical detail emerged from transaction data. Morrow had purchased multiple batteries, small-gauge electrical wire, and engine oil suitable for mini generators, all elements consistent with Paul's testimony about the low hum and flickering lights inside the tunnel. Residency records showed Morrow had moved at least 4 times between 2018 and 2022, each time to rented homes in isolated areas near public land or adjacent to roads with no traffic. This pattern matched the mobile confinement base model. The perpetrator used multiple locations to store supplies or carry out preparatory steps before bringing victims to the main tunnel. When all factors were compared, supply purchase transactions, appearances at the red points, federal camera data, SUV imagery, travel habits, materials found in the wooden shack, and DNA from another victim, the investigators unanimously identified Richard Morrow as suspect number 1, the only individual on the list with access to the area, knowledge of the terrain, ownership of a matching vehicle, and behavioral patterns of compulsive control that fully aligned with Paul Anderson's testimony throughout his captivity. After identifying Richard Morrow as suspect number 1, the investigation team launched an in-depth analysis phase of his entire travel routes along Route 66 and the secondary roads extending from the outskirts of Holbrook to the western area of Winslow and the eastern edge of Joseph City. Data was extracted from the federal traffic camera system, state-level cameras, Arizona Department of Transportation cameras, virtual way stations, and even motion-activated cameras scattered along low-traffic routes. The retrieval process lasted many weeks, compiling more than 30 terabytes of images and automatic license plate recognition, ALPR data, covering the time frame from the beginning of 2017 to mid-2023, a long enough period to build a model of recurring travel patterns. After the ALPR system filtered out non-matching vehicles, The investigation team focused on images capturing the dark-colored SUV that Morrow had previously registered as owning, featuring the distinctive small dent on the left rear door, which matched the description Paul provided in his testimony about the moment he was locked in the vehicle's cargo area. In total, this SUV appeared 226 times in the camera system. Of those, 83 instances were clear enough to compare time, location, and direction of travel. When all the data was input into GIS spatial simulation software, the analysis team noticed a striking coincidence. Many of the SUV's appearances were in areas near the 17 red points on the map that Paul had been forced to draw during his captivity. By overlaying the red route map onto real Arizona terrain maps, the technicians determined that 14 of the 17 red points fell within a radius of 1 to 3 miles from camera locations that had recorded Morrow's SUV. In particular, at red point number 3, camera data from a truck inspection station captured Morrow's SUV passing through at dawn just 48 hours before NOAA satellite imagery recorded unusual soil erosion precisely in the area where materials matching the confinement tunnel were later found. When the route analysis team arranged the data chronologically, they constructed a timeline spanning many years. Morrow tended to leave residential areas late at night, or at dawn, traveling in long looping arcs from Winslow to the southern desert lands near Holbrook, then disappearing from tracking in areas without camera coverage, precisely the vast desert regions where confinement tunnels were discovered. Several hours later, cameras on secondary roads would again capture the SUV returning, sometimes heavily coated in distinctive red dust, occasionally showing damp soil on the undercarriage, indicating the vehicle had just passed through soft soil areas, a factor consistent with Paul's description of the soil texture where he was forced to labor. When all SUV appearances were matched against the times Paul described being forced to dig earth, expand the tunnel, transport materials, or endure long periods when the perpetrator was absent, the analysis team observed an almost perfect alignment in cycles. For example, during the period Paul said he was forced into continuous labor during the strong wind season, cameras at the western gateway of Winslow recorded Morrow's SUV heading into the desert nearly every night for 3 consecutive weeks. At red point number 7, where Paul's map showed unusually heavy line markings, the automatic camera system on XA0401 captured Morrow's SUV. On the exact day Paul stated he was transferred to temporary confinement in the wooden shack, strongly reinforcing the victim's testimony. Particularly critical was the timing tied to the day Paul was abducted. Traffic cameras on the Route 66 segment near Williams recorded Morrow's SUV heading west at approximately 9:30 p.m. Only 17 minutes before the last camera captured Paul's Ford Ranger leaving town. At 10:02 p.m., a secondary road camera about 5 miles from Paul's disappearance point recorded the dark SUV turning onto an open dirt area leading into the remote northern region. This created a minute-by-minute timeline that aligned perfectly with Paul's account of how he was approached, subdued, and placed in the vehicle's rear compartment. Each small piece of data, when viewed in isolation, offered only a vague picture. But when combined into a continuous timeline, Morrow's actions formed a clear pattern. He traveled between the red points almost on schedule, visiting them in regular cycles, lingering multiple times at locations later confirmed as tunnels, shacks, or sites where biological evidence appeared. The analysis team also found interesting evidence from a private farm camera about 4 miles from red point number 12. Morrow's SUV appeared at 3:14 a.m., with headlights off, moving at very low speed, indicating an approach to or departure from an underground structure while trying to avoid attention. The map of the 17 red points showed that the perpetrator maintained a network of operational stations scattered across the region, and camera data confirmed Morrow's presence, at least at 12 of these locations over 6 years, a powerful confirmation that his travel routes aligned completely with Paul's captivity route. When the analysis was completed, the investigation team presented the conclusion that these were not just a few random coincidences, but a systematic criminal pattern. Richard Morrow operated his vehicle across the red points in behavior repeated over many years, demonstrating direct involvement in the entire mobile confinement structure. When the analysis of the red route map combined with camera data, narrowed the search area to a remote stretch of desert near the Arizona-New Mexico border. Federal investigators decided to execute a coordinated SWAT raid after multiple indicators showed that Richard Morrow's main bunker was located deep within public land where virtually no residents lived. Heat maps recorded unusual vehicle movement at dawn, old tire tracks, and ground radar data revealed abnormal compression beneath the dry soil layer, all converging at a single set of coordinates. At 4:10 a.m., the SWAT team approached the area by moving silently across gravel and sand terrain, using infrared binoculars to observe dark strips of ground where wind-blown shadows created moving patches that made it difficult to distinguish objects protruding from the surface. When the scout team reported the target area completely devoid of human presence, SWAT established a 300-meter perimeter containment, blocking all dirt road access points. Reconnaissance drones were launched to high altitude, using thermal sensors to scan for any heat sources emanating from beneath the ground, and immediately detected an area with significantly lower thermal output, indicating a hollow structure below the surface. The order to advance was given when the drone confirmed the existence of a sunken entrance covered by a large plywood sheet and a thin layer of soil, clearly camouflaged on purpose. As the SWAT team moved closer, they observed that the steel tunnel door was coated in a thick layer of dust. The hinges were rusted but still showed signs of recent use, evidenced by dust swept clean in a semicircular arc directly in front of the door. A technician inserted a fiber optic camera through a small gap, confirming that the interior structure matched Paul Anderson's description. A narrow chamber, plywood walls reinforced with metal, hard-packed dirt floor, and a steel pipe ventilation system running horizontally outward. The breaching order was executed by SWAT using hydraulic bolt-cutting tools. A sharp metallic screech echoed as the hinges were forced apart. Then the door fell aside to reveal the pitch-black space below. When tactical flashlights illuminated the tunnel, the entry team immediately recognized signs of long-term confinement. Cut binding ropes, metal rings anchored in the corner walls, numerous deep-wear grooves in the dirt floor consistent with a victim being forced to sit or kneel in the same position for extended periods. The smell of old earth, dampness, and rusted metal still lingered, matching Paul's description of the characteristic odor inside the bunker. As the investigation team entered, they began meticulously documenting every detail. On the east wall, they found a cracked wooden panel whose surface still bore evenly rotating wear, marks exactly the traces Paul described when he was forced to press his back against the wall. Nearby was a large bent metal hook with rotted nylon fibers attached, consistent with the type of binding rope forensic teams had recovered at the first red point. Beneath the tunnel floor, forensic technicians collected numerous small bone fragments, not human, but animal bones, cut with crude tools, proving the perpetrator had once used this space to carry out coercive or psychologically threatening acts. Along the ventilation pipe, they discovered scratch marks in the exact positions Paul had described when crawling through to escape. Metal worn thin into long grooves, interspersed with rough patches where shoulders and elbows could have rubbed. Forensic teams collected DNA samples from multiple locations, on the door latch, beneath the ventilation pipe, and on the north wall section. On-site rapid results showed Paul's DNA present at several different points inside the bunker, strongly reinforcing his testimony of prolonged confinement at this location. Notably, the investigation team also detected DNA from an unidentified individual, matching the unknown victim's DNA found at the wooden shack in the second red point, indicating that this main bunker had not only been used to hold Paul, but was likely used to confine at least one other victim. The bunker structure fully matched the model Paul described: a single room, plywood walls, weak metal framing, dual ventilation pipes, one outward closing iron door, and scattered items of exactly the types of materials the perpetrator routinely purchased at local stores, all aligning with behavioral analysis, physical evidence, and vehicle movement data. When the technical team used metal corrosion measurement equipment to determine the structure's age, the readings showed the bunker had been in use for many years and had undergone multiple repair cycles, precisely as Paul recounted, being forced to dig trenches, reinforce walls, and transport materials. In one corner of the bunker, They found a wooden box containing hand-drawn maps, red zigzag lines identical to the ones Paul had been forced to copy. Some sheets were still caked with dirt, the writing more scribbled symbols than actual maps, proving this was not a casual activity, but a repeated forced pattern. The lid of the box still bore faint fingerprint traces that partially matched Richard Morrow's record in federal databases, indicating he had directly handled this evidence. Additionally, at the base of the west wall, the investigation team found a short electrical cable running outward, leading to a small generator concealed under dry soil, consistent with Paul's description of the low generator hum whenever the lights flickered. The discovery of this temporary electrical system confirmed the perpetrator had planned to maintain the bunker over a long period, using basic equipment to sustain lighting and make interior modifications. Every detail from odor, temperature, construction, sounds, materials, binding marks, and spatial arrangement matched Paul Anderson's testimony with no significant discrepancies. With Paul's DNA recovered, DNA from another victim, evidence of illegal construction, matching loose items from the red points, and a structure that completely aligned with Paul's description, federal investigators officially confirmed this desert bunker as the perpetrator's primary confinement site, the central location in Richard Morrow's entire extended operational network. After the main bunker was confirmed and all evidence matched Paul Anderson's testimony, federal investigators launched a large-scale manhunt operation to cut off any possibility of Richard Morrow moving deeper into the vast lands of the Navajo Nation. Traffic camera data, continuously scanned using vehicle tracking algorithms, recorded at 6:12 a.m. An image of a white mid-size RV with a small dent on the left rear door in the same position as the dent previously seen on Morrow's SUV, traveling on the road leading into the western edge of Chinle. The license plate was almost completely obscured by red desert mud, but the body structure, grille design, and window style matched the RV Morrow had previously registered under a temporary rental identity. Magnified images showed the windshield covered with a hand-applied reflective film intended to evade identification, a clear sign the suspect was deliberately avoiding federal camera systems. Upon receiving the alert from the Navajo Nation Department of Transportation, the FBI activated the Federal Immediate Mobility Block Protocol, immediately sending alerts to all patrol units across the wide territory stretching from Chinle down to Highway 191 and eastward near the New Mexico border. 3 rapid response teams were mobilized. 1 from the FBI field office in Flagstaff, 1 U.S. Marshals team from Gallup, and 1 Navajo police team stationed at Kayenta. Based on Morrow's multi-year travel pattern always avoiding populated areas, preferring dirt roads or secondary routes, the rapid analysis team mapped a high-probability containment corridor for deploying intercept teams. At 10:27 a.m., a motion sensor camera near a culvert on Highway 264 recorded a similar RV heading east, at erratic speeds, surging forward, then suddenly slowing behavior, consistent with a driver constantly checking the rearview mirror to monitor. Pursuing forces. Recognizing the suspect was leaving the Chinle area to enter more open desert terrain where encirclement would be difficult, Navajo Nation police patrol units began pursuit, using encrypted radio to avoid frequency exposure. As forces closed in from behind, Morrow suddenly accelerated, causing the RV to shake violently, red dust billowing in a long plume that clouded the entire road behind. FBI Air 12 helicopter took off from Flagstaff, and within 14 minutes was overhead, using thermal cameras to lock onto the target despite the thick desert dust cloud. Thermal data showed the RV's engine running abnormally hot, indicating the vehicle was being pushed beyond capacity while the suspect attempted to break out of the containment. When the chase extended onto the connecting segment to Highway 264, near Window Rock, U.S., Marshals immediately deployed tactical roadblock measures. 2 specialized vehicles set up a barrier blocking the forward path, while other units closed in from both sides to force the suspect to slow. However, Morrow did not stop. Instead, he swerved sharply right, sending the RV crashing into a steep dirt embankment. The front wheels sank into loose gravel and soil, causing the vehicle to lose balance, tilt sharply left, then roll over with a loud crash echoing across the valley. The helicopter trained high-intensity lights on the crash site, applying pressure that prevented the suspect from continuing movement. When the RV door burst open, Morrow attempted to flee, running along the slope, but within seconds, federal SWAT was on him. One officer fired a beanbag round to disable his flight, striking the calf area and causing Morrow to collapse onto the ground. Two other agents immediately rushed forward, tackled him onto the gravel, and secured his hands with heavy steel cuffs. Throughout the arrest, Morrow offered no verbal resistance or shouting, but his eyes were wide open, darting constantly around the area, as though searching for an escape route he had long memorized during years of roaming the desert. A quick check inside the RV revealed items fully consistent with long-term flight preparation. Canned food, large water jugs, nylon bags containing binding cord, a metal toolbox, various wrenches, and especially a roll of fiberglass reinforced tape, identical to the type found in the bunker. On the fold-out table was an open paper map with heavily marked red lines following the exact pattern Paul had been forced to copy. In the rear compartment, examiners noted red soil traces and long scratches along the walls marked similar to those seen on the SUV, indicating Morrow habitually used vehicles to transport materials or evidence. Morrow was placed into a specialized three-tier lock transport van and moved along Highway 264 to the intersection with Highway 191, where a U.S. Marshal's helicopter was already waiting. After completing the handover procedure, Morrow was flown directly to the Federal Detention Center near Gallup and placed under high-level custody protocols to prevent any possibility of sabotage, self-harm, or access to any communication channels that could affect the ongoing investigation. Every action of his was documented from the first second of custody. In the first interrogation session after being transferred to the Federal Detention Center near Gallup, Richard Morrow maintained a prolonged silence for nearly 3 hours, simply observing the room and the investigators' eyes, as if gauging how much they truly understood about what he had constructed over many years. When the federal investigators presented images of the main bunker, the red route map, and the evidence seized from the RV, that silence cracked. Morrow began to speak, not to deny the charges, nor to plead, but to explain a distorted ideology he called the Red Route Doctrine. According to his statements, Red Route was not merely a map. It was a belief structure he had built himself over years of isolated living in the desert. He said the red line symbolized the correct path for humans once their voice has been stripped away. A sick philosophy in which he believed victims had to re-establish their self by obeying repeated commands, copying the map, learning the lines, memorizing the markers, and absolutely never questioning. He described forcing victims to draw the map as a ritual of control, to make them stay on the line and become part of the system he had created. When investigators asked how he selected victims, Morrow answered in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, as though recounting a technical procedure rather than a criminal act. He targeted people traveling alone, often in a state of fatigue after long journeys on Route 66 or desolate stretches near the Arizona-New Mexico border. He watched those who stopped at gas stations, convenience stores, or drove slowly on dirt roads. He looked for signs that made him believe the victim would not be immediately missed. No traveling in a group, no regular check-ins about location, or using lesser-known routes. When he saw Paul Anderson stop his vehicle near Williams and fail to contact his family on schedule, Morrow viewed it as perfect conditions. He even described the decisive moment, the headlights reflecting off the windshield of the Ford Ranger, a moment he believed the route itself chose the victim. During the confession, Morrow described the detention structure with cold, precise detail. The main bunker was the central point, while the wooden shacks and auxiliary dugouts were repetition points, each serving a different phase in victim control. According to him, once brought into the system, a victim would go through 3 stages: binding, disintegration, and routing. In the binding stage, the victim was restrained for extended periods to weaken the body and eliminate resistance. In the disintegration stage, the victim was forced into heavy labor or cyclical behaviors to destroy their sense of time. In the routing stage, the victim was compelled to copy the red map, the map he believed was the only path to survival. Punishments were applied for non-compliance: starvation, tightening restraints, or confinement in total darkness. He described these things not with guilt but as if outlining a long operating system. When investigators presented evidence of multiple rope fragments, wooden pegs, and metal pipes that matched at the first and second red points, Morrow nodded, confirming they belonged to transition points, locations where he adjusted materials or tested structures before expanding the main bunker. When asked why he moved between multiple sites instead of staying fixed in one place, he said the desert is always changing, and he had to keep his system in constant motion. This was also why the red map always featured multiple loops and bolded points, representing places where he set checkpoints or once reinforced structures. Investigators asked about the role of the red-marked map in the entire criminal network, and Morrow replied that it was not just a geographical map, it was order. He viewed each red line as part of a control ideology, forcing victims to memorize it repeatedly in order to erase their sense of true direction, leaving them unable to distinguish between the real world and the structure he had built. Once a victim became fully dependent on the red line, he believed they could not leave the system. This explained why Paul was forced to copy the map for many years, not to record directions, but to be imprisoned within that very repetitive act. When investigators asked about the root motive, Morrow simply answered, "I kept them on the correct line. No grudge, no thrill, no financial gain, just a pathological necessity to control and create a self-sustaining system in which every victim was a component maintaining the loop." Post-interrogation criminal psychological analysis revealed an extremist mindset. He believed he was carrying out a kind of mission, and victims had to learn to submit to the red route in order to become correct. When asked why Paul escaped, Morrow only said the bunker system had reached the time to change, a vague statement showing he did not view Paul's escape as a mistake, but as the collapse of an outdated structure. These statements, though fragmented, fit together to form a clear picture. The red map was not a minor detail, but the core of the victim control mechanism. The detention structure was not random but built in layers, and victim selection followed clear patterns that perfectly matched his behavioral timeline over many years. Thanks to this interrogation session, investigators officially confirmed the central role of the red route ideology in all of Richard Morrow's criminal behavior, as well as the mechanisms he used to maintain total control over victims for extended periods. The cross-referencing of Paul Anderson's entire statement with the physical evidence collected from the main bunker, the red points, and Richard Morrow's vehicle became the pivotal step in legitimizing the entire case file, ensuring every detail was verified to federal standards and did not rely solely on the victim's memory, which had already been impaired after many years of captivity. First, the investigative team analyzed Paul's description of the dugout: narrow dimensions, plywood walls reinforced with metal bars, packed dirt floor, ventilation pipe offset to the right side, iron door locked from the outside, the smell of rust mixed with dry earth, the low hum of a generator whenever the light flickered. All these parameters were directly measured by the technical team at the main bunker in the New Mexico desert, and the results matched almost perfectly. The plywood walls in the main bunker showed corrosion levels consistent with the time frame Paul described being held. The metal bars were hand-welded, not to industrial standards, compatible with tools Morrow commonly purchased at local stores. The ventilation pipe system was installed with a horizontal pull mechanism rather than vertical, something very rare, exactly as Paul had recounted, having to twist his body 3 times to crawl through the pipe during his escape. On the dugout walls, horizontal wear scratches were found at shoulder height, sized to match the width of Paul's shoulder frame, indicating he had rubbed against them while moving in the overly cramped space. Even the humidity, the smell of rotting wood, the metallic odor, and the echo from the narrow walls were acoustically recreated and compared by the analysis team, yielding results similar to Paul's description. This cross-referencing strongly reinforced the accuracy of the victim's statement. Next, the forensic team examined Paul's injuries and compared them with tools recovered from the bunker. On Paul's body were deep rope marks embedded into the skin at the wrists, ankles, hips, and shoulders, repetitive damage caused by rigid or non-elastic materials. When compared with the nylon rope, rough hemp cord, and fiberglass reinforced tape fragments found in the bunker, examiners concluded the wear patterns matched completely. The decayed rope fragment in the bunker had a diameter matching the indentations on Paul's wrists, while the long bruises on his shoulders corresponded to the metal bar used to pin victims against the wall during restraint. Additionally, the misaligned healed bone injuries on Paul's ribs and forearms aligned with the type of compressive force produced by continuous forced labor, such as digging tunnels or carrying heavy materials consistent with the tools, shovels, metal support bars, wooden frames, found at the scene. The match between injuries and physical evidence made it clear that Paul was not only confined in a small space, but also subjected to prolonged forced labor, exactly as he had described in his interrogation sessions. One particularly crucial element was cross-referencing the timeline Paul described for his captivity with Richard Morrow's periodic purchase history. Purchase records showed Morrow regularly bought canned food, gallon water, duct tape, binding cord, plywood sheets, and metal pipes in cycles of 6 to 8 weeks. Notably, these transactions continued throughout the 4 years Paul was missing. When compared with Paul's descriptions of periods of starvation, times when the dugout was repaired or expanded, and cycles of forced labor, investigators noticed an almost periodic overlap. Whenever Morrow bought large quantities of water and food, Paul recalled that he would disappear for a few days, then return with new supplies. Whenever Morrow bought wood and bolts, Paul remembered being forced to dig to expand the dugout walls. Whenever Morrow bought flashlights, electrical wire, or engine oil, Paul remembered the generator sound changing or the bunker lighting becoming unusual. When the two data streams, Paul's memory-based account and Morrow's transactions, were overlaid, the timelines aligned perfectly. This was extremely powerful evidence because it did not rely on subjective perception but on real financial and physical records. In addition, the investigative team cross-referenced the number of days Paul described being moved between the main bunker and auxiliary structures, with traffic camera data recording Morrow's appearances at each of the 17 red points. In 31 instances where Paul recalled specific transfer dates, 27 matched Morrow's routes captured on camera. The probability of random coincidence was virtually zero. Paul's descriptions of weather, strong windy days, light rain days, nights with thunder, were also compared with daily meteorological data. The results showed his descriptions were accurate to a surprising degree, proving he truly lived through those conditions and could not have imagined them. This cross-referencing helped confirm the reliability of his statement and the information he provided about the duration of captivity. When all elements were put together, Paul's description fully matching the bunker structure, injuries matching the evidence, captivity timeline matching Morrow's purchase cycles, routes matching the 17 red points, the investigative force concluded there was no reasonable gap left for doubt. The case file met the highest federal charging standards, based on independent but completely consistent layers of evidence. At the end of the summary report, the federal investigator wrote clearly, "The victim's statement is not merely consistent with reality, it is corroborated by every layer of physical, financial, technical, and on-scene evidence. This file provides sufficient grounds to conclude that kidnapping, prolonged detention, and torture were carried out by Richard Morrow over many years, with no remaining plausible innocent explanation." This marked the most significant completion milestone in the entire investigation process. The federal trial of Richard Morrow opened at the United States District Court in Albuquerque, drawing an unprecedented level of attention from the public, the legal community, and civil rights organizations due to the exceptionally grave nature of the case. When the federal prosecutor began presenting the indictment, the entire courtroom fell deathly silent. The prosecution laid out a massive forensic evidence system spanning thousands of pages, including DNA results collected from the main bunker, DNA from Paul Anderson, and DNA from another unidentified victim, rope fragments, metal bars, plywood sheets, and the red-marked map recovered at the scene. Morrow's purchase history of supplies, traffic camera data, and especially the three-dimensional bunker model reconstructed by the investigative team based on Paul's statement, combined with on-site surveys. The prosecutor displayed images of the main bunker, the ventilation pipe, force-dug pits, rope marks on the walls, DNA discovery locations, and every detail that matched the victim's description. These exhibits were presented in chronological order, accompanied by financial records proving Morrow purchased construction materials in small quantities throughout the 4 years Paul was missing. When it came to Paul's testimony, the prosecution spent considerable time demonstrating that his memory, though damaged by PTSD, remained consistent and was corroborated by independent layers of evidence. Forensic experts, environmental specialists, on-scene investigators, and injury examiners took the stand one after another, describing how the parameters in the statement matched the physical site: bunker height, soil humidity, ventilation pipe position, wind direction, sounds inside the dugout, and the locations of injuries on the victim's ribs and wrists. When the prosecution introduced the red route map, the very thing Morrow regarded as the core of his ideology, the jury was shown an overlaid version comparing the map Paul was forced to draw with the actual field map of Arizona, New Mexico. The near-perfect match left many jurors visibly stunned. The next portion of the indictment focused on the conduct: kidnapping, prolonged detention, psychological torture, and forced labor. The prosecution presented a timeline built from federal camera footage. Every time the bunker underwent repairs, Morrow was recorded appearing near the red points. Every time Paul said he was moved to an auxiliary dugout, cameras captured Morrow's RV or SUV in the same area. To strengthen the element of attempted murder, the prosecution introduced evidence from the unidentified victim's DNA, showing that Morrow had not targeted just one victim but had repeated the behavior multiple times, pushing the charges close to the standard of endangering the lives of multiple victims. The defense offered only vague arguments that Paul might have misremembered, but every claim collapsed when the prosecution presented the chain of Morrow's purchase transactions that aligned precisely with the moments Paul described being starved, restrained, forced to dig, or relocated. One of the most critical moments of the trial came when the acoustic expert presented a comparative analysis of the generator sound inside the bunker against the sound Paul recalled in his memory. The frequency waveforms matched down to the exact points, causing virtually all defense rebuttals to crumble. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom atmosphere was thick with tension. But after only 4 hours, an unusually short time for such a complex case, they returned with their verdict. Richard Morrow, guilty of federal kidnapping, prolonged detention, torture, attempted murder, and endangering the lives of multiple victims. The jury foreman read each count aloud, and with every utterance of guilty, the room sank into a chilling silence. During sentencing, the federal judge emphasized that Morrow's conduct demonstrated a level of control, cruelty, and calculation far beyond ordinary criminal norms, and that the red-marked map served as the tool for a years-long torture system. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole, plus an additional 60 years consecutive for the federal offenses related to kidnapping, detention, and severe bodily harm. At the conclusion of the ruling, the judge signed an order sealing the entire federal case file, confirming that all evidence had been fully adjudicated and that the trial process had strictly adhered to United States court standards. After the federal trial concluded and Richard Morrow was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 60 years without parole, Paul Anderson began a long recovery phase, a journey that was far from simple, even after he escaped the bunker and returned to normal life. Doctors at the Federal Recovery Center in Albuquerque reported that Paul's physical condition improved month by month. Body weight gradually increased after years of malnutrition. His muscular system recovered slowly but steadily, and bone density, severely reduced due to lack of sunlight and limited movement, gradually returned to manageable levels through physical therapy and nutritional supplements. Nevertheless, long-term injuries such as misaligned healed ribs, slight deformity in the forearms, and soft tissue damage in the shoulders could not fully recover, becoming permanent marks of his captivity. Most importantly, Paul's psychological recovery required close monitoring by PTSD specialists. Evaluation records showed that Paul suffered from complex PTSD, formed over many years of isolation, behavioral control, and enduring invisible punishment cycles inside the bunker. He frequently experienced mild panic attacks when hearing metal clanging together, the low hum of a generator, or when entering dimly lit confined spaces. On some nights, Paul still woke up in the middle of nightmares, believing he was being forced back onto the red path in the map that Morrow had made him draw over and over. Therapists guided Paul in rebuilding a sense of safety through controlled exposure exercises, keeping lights on while sleeping, practicing breathing when hearing triggering sounds, and journaling to re-establish boundaries between memory and the present. Every small progress was recorded as a major step forward for someone who had endured prolonged captivity. In terms of family life, Paul's return brought both joy and challenges that were not easy to overcome. His family, who had lived in fragile hope for 4 years, welcomed him with deep love. But they also had to learn how to adjust in order to support his recovery. Paul's parents regularly attended family counseling sessions organized by the FBI, where they were taught appropriate ways to communicate with survivors of prolonged detention, how to avoid triggering painful memories, and how to create a stable emotional environment. The local community and Flagstaff showed special care as well. Fundraising events to support Paul's reintegration were organized by volunteer groups and local churches, while neighbors carefully protected his privacy, trying to prevent additional pressure from the media on someone still recovering. However, this attention sometimes made Paul feel overly observed, something experts assessed as a normal reaction for someone who had spent many years in forced isolation. While Paul focused on healing, the FBI did not fully close the case. Although Morrow had been convicted, the federal file remained open regarding 3 of the 17 red points that the investigative team had not been able to fully verify due to terrain conditions or restrictions on accessing federal public land. DNA from the unidentified victim collected at the wooden shack continued to be compared against national databases such as NamUs and CODIS. Federal agents still conducted periodic surveys, especially during seasons when desert winds or soil erosion might expose new artifacts. Paul was kept informed about this progress, but he chose not to participate directly to avoid re-entering the emotional spiral tied to those years of lost freedom. Although the recovery journey continued, Paul had achieved basic stability. He could walk outdoors in sunlight without becoming overwhelmed, sleep for several consecutive hours in a safe environment, and talk with his family without feeling threatened. He still carried with him a new map, not the haunting red map of Morrow, but a map of hiking trails around Flagstaff recommended by his therapist to retrain his sense of orientation in a world no longer imprisoned. Nevertheless, the psychological consequences of years of control, separation from community, and forced repetitive behaviors remained. Sudden anxiety attacks, feelings of unsafety in enclosed rooms, and excessive wariness toward strangers. Experts noted that Paul might live with these invisible scars for the rest of his life, but at the present moment, he had escaped the red route, both literally and figuratively, and was gradually rebuilding a real life of his own, no longer dominated by the darkness of the desert or the silent years of captivity. In the context of today's American society, where people move constantly, rely on navigation technology, and often believe that modern surveillance systems can protect every journey, Paul Anderson's story reminds us that even in a country with advanced security infrastructure, invisible gaps still exist between states, along long desert highways, and in moments of human complacency. Paul disappeared on Route 66, one of America's most iconic roads, showing that danger does not only lie in places considered risky, but sometimes right on familiar tourist corridors. The fact that he lost contact for just a few hours, and the perpetrator exploited precisely the isolation of the route, serves as a reminder that every trip needs a safety plan. Sharing the itinerary with loved ones, maintaining regular check-ins, and understanding the characteristics of the environment being traveled through. The story also highlights an important reality in American society. Surveillance systems, traffic cameras, and federal databases only become effective when there is accurate information to cross-reference. It was precisely the details Paul remembered: the smell of earth in the bunker, wind direction, generator sounds, the feel of the ventilation pipe that allowed the FBI to narrow down locations and rescue him from 4 years of invisibility. This reminds us that the ability to observe and respect personal intuition remains an essential life skill, even in the age of high technology. Finally, Paul's recovery process from PTSD shows that American society needs to continue breaking down stigma around mental health. He could only gradually stabilize thanks to an interdisciplinary support system. Family, therapists, the Flagstaff community demonstrating that proper care and support can help a survivor overcome long-term darkness. The biggest lesson from this story is, personal safety does not come solely from technology or laws, but begins with preparation, attention, and the solidarity of our own communities. If you want to continue following survival and justice stories like Paul Anderson's painful journey home, please hit subscribe so you don't miss any videos. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next episode, where we continue to uncover the hidden truths behind the shadows of America.